podcast listeners. Welcome back to a new episode of Britain in 1919 to 1939. In this episode, we will be looking at how society and living standards changed during the interwar period. As a result of the First World War, there was a rise in equality in the United Kingdom as women's roles began to evolve. This is a key area that I would like to start off the episode by speaking about. During the First World War, women were increasingly employed in order to contribute to the war effort. In July 1914, 3.3 million women were employed in Britain. This increased to 4.7 million by July 1917. Additionally, British women were recruited to serve in uniform in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. A key policy was the implementation of the Representation of the People Act in 1918. Not only did it remove the classist laws that meant you had to own property to vote, but it also introduced partial women's suffrage for women over the age of 30. Then in 1928, there was complete suffrage, as women were now covered on the same terms as men. These changes to voting laws meant that there was a better chance for Labour to be elected, as the working class and women could now vote. The 1919 Sex Disqualification Act enabled women to work in even more professions. The 1920 Unemployment Insurance Act provided 39 weeks of unemployment benefits to most workers, excluding civil servants, domestic workers and farmers. With regards to this, unemployed women were paid 12 shillings a week, whilst unemployed men were paid 15 shillings a week. This reflected the remaining disparity between working men and women, as women were paid significantly less than men. The evolution in women's rights was not necessarily embraced by working class men, who believed that women who could be hired at a lower salary were taking their jobs. In fact, the red clandestine that conservatives feared was a communist revolution was nothing of the sort. Actually, the main goal was to exclude racial minorities and women who would work for lower salaries from areas of the workforce and the good jobs that they themselves wanted. This connects this key issue to another key issue during the interwar period, which was unemployment. A few programs were implemented to deal with the issue of unemployment. The Unemployment Insurance Act of 1920 expanded the policies of the 1911 National Insurance Act, as it would provide 39 weeks of unemployment benefit to most workers. It was funded by the taxpayers and provided 15 shillings a week to unemployed men and 12 shillings a week to unemployed women, as I've already mentioned just now. The Conservative governments led by Baldwin and Chamberlain further expanded the programme, with the number of workers in the scheme rising from 11 million in 1920 to 15.4 million in 1938. However, the mandatory means test implemented in 1931 to reduce government costs during the Great Depression limited the number of people who could receive the benefits from then on. Despite this act, which could be seen as cutting back on social spending, Paul Addison, a British historian known for his research on the political history of Britain during the Second World War, described Britain's social services as the most advanced in the world in 1939. National health insurance had been expanded, including more and more hospitals, and providing health benefits and medical treatment subsidies. By 1938, 20 million workers were involved in this health insurance scheme. Another key issue was housing, although this proved to be a huge success later on. In the UK, there was a rapid expansion of housing in the 1930s, with the construction and housing industries proving to be one of the most profitable industries in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, in stark contrast to the United States, which suffered a decline in housing construction during the Great Depression. The numbers show that the housing stock in England and Wales rose from a total of 7.6 million in 1911 to 11.3 million in 1939, with approximately 2 million of these built since 1930. This was partly due to the 1918 Tudor-Walters report, which standardized council housing design and location for the next 9 decades. Meanwhile, the Housing and Town Planning Act, introduced by Lloyd George in 1918, required local authorities to calculate their housing needs and begin construction of government housing to replace slums, with the Treasury subsidising low rents. Moreover, Lloyd George's 1918 campaign of Homes for the Heroes ended up a failure due to the difficulty of quick deadlines, rising costs, and a lack of building materials, despite the visionary proposals which would provide homes for those who had served in the war. While people in certain areas of the United Kingdom struggled, there were benefits for the upper and middle class people in Britain, as the UK experienced general economic growth in the 1930s. Though the British economy shrank by 9.9% in 1930 and by 5% in 1931, it grew by 0.44%, 3.29%, 6.21%, 3.68%, 4.92%, and 3.47% in 1932, 33, 34, 35, 36, and 1937, respectively. During this period of time, new mass-produced goods came into production, such as cars, radios, cookers, and fridges, sparking a growth in these modern manufacturing industries. The introduction of credit allowed people to buy now and pay later, allowing them to purchase modern goods that they would not have been able to afford before. With this, there was a drastic increase in car ownership, with 2 million cars sold alone in 1938. The most purchased car was £100 cheaper than in 1923, as the Austin 7 could be purchased for just £125 in 1936. This increasing car ownership, which makes individual transportation easier, may have contributed to the rise in domestic holidays, with seaside towns like Bournemouth becoming more popular holiday destinations. This was also due to the reduction in working hours and the introduction of annual paid holidays. Britons increasingly travelled to seaside resorts for their holidays, with Blackpool receiving 7 million visitors annually in the 1930s. Moreover, there was a 1,200% increase in electrified homes. With this, more and more people were attracted to new electrical consumer goods, and by 1937, over 50% of British households had radios, and generally listened to stations hosted by the British Broadcasting Corporation. Young women made up the largest group of listeners, as they did as the largest group of cinema visitors. The falling prices in the Great Depression, the reduction in family sizes, and the growth of the economy in the 1930s meant that there was more money available for upper and middle class families to purchase luxury goods and spend on leisure activities. Other than the domestic holidays I've mentioned, there were other leisure activities that increased in popularity during the 1930s. Though the British film industry had emerged back in the 1890s with a strong reputation coming from the London-based market, the American market dwarfed British efforts, producing over 80% of the world's film in the 1920s. Despite a government-mandated quota for British-made films, they were unable to capture the attention of the largest markets. Hollywood films dominated the American, Canadian, and Australian markets, whilst Bollywood dominated the Indian market. In the 1930s, there was a rise in British films, assisted by the inflow of Jewish actors, directors, and producers who were fleeing Nazi Germany. This still made little difference. In the UK, cinemas were constructed on a huge scale, allowing for large audiences to view popular Hollywood films. Visiting the cinema became a much more common activity for Britons. 40% of Liverpudlians visited one of the major cities' 69 cinemas at least once a week, whilst 25 visited twice a week. Another activity that was increasing in popularity was the participation in sporting activities and watching sports games. Cricket became a symbol of the imperialist British Empire, and football attracted the working class people living in the cities. Meanwhile, new sports, which consequently attracted more women than other sports did, were emerging, including cycling, golf, hockey, and tennis. There was another leisure activity that helped to create a greater sense of a community in Britain. Upper class, middle class, and working class pubs portrayed drinking as a way of leisurely socialising, while spending spare cash. However, pubs were hit hard by the Depression, as people had less extra money to spend on leisure, and taxes were raised on beer. There was another change in society in the 1930s, the presence and importance of religion. By the 1930s, church attendance had declined to half the level of 1901. Moreover, people were less concerned with sending their children to religious schools. The Church of England's share in the population of primary school students dropped from 57% in 1918 to 39% in 1939, whilst the Methodist Church operated 738 schools in 1902, but only 28 in 1996. As the literacy rate continued to improve and leisure time increased after the First World War, reading became more popular. Adult fiction doubled in the 1920s, reaching 2,800 new books annually by 1935. Meanwhile, the fiction series of libraries grew threefold as new fiction increased in demand, later helped by the increased accessibility of books due to the introduction of the cheap paperback in 1935. Society and living standards in the 1930s largely depended on what social class you were a part of. The lower working classes struggled to provide food for their families, while upper and middle class families experienced improvements to their quality of life. It seemed that as a result of the Great Depression, the poor kept getting poorer while the rich got richer. Thank you for listening to this episode of History from One Student to Another. Please click subscribe to be notified when the next episode is released. You can find links to my social media and methods of contacting me in the description below. I would also greatly appreciate it if you would be so kind as to buy me a coffee via the links in the description. Thank you again for tuning in. Goodbye, and see you in the next episode.